The Hub is presented by Calvo Enterprises, Inc.
The Indo-Pacific region is on the cusp of a new missile age. Those are the sobering words of missile expert Ankit Panda from the well-respected Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Panda was on Guam recently as the keynote speaker at the University of Guam's College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences 45th Annual Research Conference. His speech focused on the escalation of military defense capabilities throughout the Indo-Pacific, including Guam. In fact, much has been said locally about the Defense Department's plans for an unprecedented 360-degree missile defense system for the island to protect assets and defend the military and civilian populations against potential attack. And while Panda says Guam has been and likely always will be a target of American adversaries, the public can take some comfort in knowing that Panda believes an attack by a foreign aggressor is neither imminent or inevitable. When we come back, our conversation with award-winning writer and international security expert Ankit Panda. Don't go away.
The Hub is presented by Calvo Enterprises, Inc. The Hub is presented by Calvo Enterprises, Inc.
Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to The Hub. I'm Nestor Lecanto. Our guest this week is Mr. Ankit Panda, who is an international security expert with the Carnegie Endowment on International Peace. Ankit, welcome to The Hub.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Okay, let me start off with, in your recent speech at the University of Guam, you talked about the region is at the cusp of a new missile age. I was wondering, could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So I don't think it's news to anyone that geopolitical tensions in the Pacific have intensified quite a bit in the last 10 years, really, driven primarily by differences between the United States and China. But more broadly, we can also look to the Korean Peninsula, where tensions between South Korea and North Korea have grown quite tense as well. What this has led to, among many things, is a buildup in defense capabilities across the board in China and North Korea, in the United States, among U.S. allies in the region. And one of the ways in which this buildup has manifested in particular has been the pursuit of missile capabilities, which I think present a set of risks that are particularly unique. These missiles, of course, in many cases carry nuclear weapons, in the case of countries like China, North Korea, and the United States. But not necessarily across the board. Notably, none of the new missiles the U.S. is building are nuclear capable in the Pacific, but of course the U.S. does have a range of nuclear capabilities that could be brought to bear in a significant conventional conflict potentially in this region. So that's really what I was talking about. In my research, I've been looking at some of the implications of this, how to potentially limit some of the worst consequences, and I'm happy to talk about any of that today.
Sure. So as you know, the Department of Defense is contemplating a 360-degree missile defense system for Guam. Could you talk us through what that is exactly and how effective do you think that would be?
Sure. So Guam, of course, as it's well known to its inhabitants, is a major forward operating logistical node for the U.S. military, with the naval base, with the Anderson Air Force Base, so on and so forth. And so in that type of a conventional conflict that I described in my opening comment, it is, of course, quite plausible that American adversaries, be it North Korea or China, would aim to strike those targets to prevent the United States from potentially surging its military forces to come to the aid of Taiwan or South Korea, so on and so forth. American adversaries have looked for a long time to see how the United States prosecutes expeditionary wars very far away from our own shores. And they understand, of course, the reliance that we have on territory alliances to be able to project power. And Guam stands as a uniquely important node for the United States in that way. So this plan to set up a new enhanced integrated air and missile defense system for Guam is, of course, designed to make that task for America's adversaries more difficult. Of course, no missile defense system will serve the role of a perfect shield. There is no such thing. What missile defenses can do is complicate planning for an attacker. The attacker will have to devote additional resources, having to account for the fact that missile defense might be able to absorb some of the incoming missiles. So that is ultimately what I think is being done here. The plan, as I understand it, is to significantly increase the protected nature of Guam. If that plan goes as foreseen, which of course there's many question marks there with potential cost overruns and other bureaucratic difficulties, Guam will end up having, on a per square mile basis, the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. That doesn't mean Guam will be invulnerable to attack, but it will mean that U.S. adversaries will have to consider the role of missile defenses as they potentially plan strikes on Guam.
Yeah. Why do you think DoD chose this particular missile defense system? Because, as I understand it, it's kind of unprecedented. There's no real example of it anywhere else on the globe, is there?
That's right. There isn't really, but I would also say that the nature of the missile threats that Guam uniquely faces are also somewhat unprecedented. So the plan as it stands will include a layered range of systems, some systems that are designed to destroy missiles in their final stages of flight, literally right before they reach Guam. Other systems that will be capable of destroying incoming missiles outside of the Earth's atmosphere. Ballistic missiles, for instance, fly very high above the Earth on their way to their target. So it will be a mixture of capabilities. There will, of course, be efforts to add additional radar systems as well. That, of course, has implications for Guam's airspace, potentially affecting civilian aircraft that might be landing at the airport there, potentially having some effects on Guam's economy given the high level of tourism. So there's a lot that's being considered as part of the environmental impact survey that's ongoing to look at how these capabilities would fundamentally change everyday life on Guam in peacetime, regardless of the potential wartime benefits for the U.S. military.
Yeah, and as you suggest, one of the biggest concerns, I suppose, is that it would, I guess, take over 20 sites. And Guam, as you know, is a very small and land is very scarce and very valuable resource for the people. So there's a lot of concern about this particular choice of a missile defense system because it is so land intensive.
That's right. So my understanding is that a lot of out of the 20 sites that are under study right now for this system, many are on existing parcels of land controlled by the U.S. military. So if I had to guess, I would suspect that in the course of the survey, the disruptive effect of potentially deploying some of these capabilities, I think, will likely be evaluated with regard to whether some of these facilities can be deployed on land that's already controlled by the U.S. military. But absolutely, I think that's an entirely valid concern. And depending on how these missile defense systems are, not every missile defense system is designed to operate in the same way. So there are also specific considerations, particularly with point defense systems, those systems that are designed to destroy missiles right before they reach their targets. Those are most effective when they are co-located with the targets that they are trying to defend. So in the case of a facility like Andersen Air Force Base, there is an interest in defending against missiles right as they are about to arrive, potentially including cruise missiles, which, by the way, could also be launched from ship and aircraft in the case of an adversary like China. I think there will be a strong interest to make sure that those systems can be deployed as close as possible, or ideally on the base.
Yeah. Would you say that the horse has left the barn, the train has left the station? There's no more turning back from this particular 360-degree missile defense system option?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I think as part of the ongoing survey, there could simply be an outcome here that suggests that the costs are going to outweigh the benefit, the cost to Guam. There have been plans in the past, for instance, to surge the U.S. military's presence on Guam that just simply haven't been seen as environmentally sustainable. That said, I think what has left the barn, broadly speaking, is Guam's central role in this geopolitical confrontation in the Pacific. And so, unfortunately, as long as U.S.-China tensions continue to fester, and here's where some of my work on arms control and diplomacy comes in, as long as these things continue and Guam will be sort of in the crosshairs, so to speak, the United States will have to give quite a bit of thought for how to ensure that it is able to sustain its military operations in the Pacific out of Guam. There are efforts, of course, to try to disperse U.S. capabilities to other sites in the Pacific, but there's really no substituting what the United States military gains from Guam in the short term. So a lot of this, I think, continues to be a function of the broader geopolitical competition between the two countries.
Yeah, let's step back a little bit from the missile defense system and talk about that, the broader implications of this. Just from your perspective, how tense is the situation with respect to North Korea and with China and the Taiwan situation?
So look, I mean, in both of those cases, I don't see any imminent reason to believe that there's likely to be a conflict deliberately initiated by China or North Korea. But in both cases, I think there is plenty of room for crises to potentially spiral out of control. In the China-U.S. case, there have actually been, I think, in the last 6 months or so, some positive signs. We had a meeting between the US and China last November on arms control, followed by the San Francisco summit meeting between President Biden and President Xi. That hasn't, of course, diffused the sources of tensions between the two countries, but it has at least um, taken us back from where we were potentially earlier last year, if you recall the high altitude balloon incident over the continental United States. But of course, we have to be open to the possibility that there could be an unintended clash, for instance, in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea between a U.S. warship or surveillance aircraft operating in international space lawfully and the Chinese military, which could, of course, develop in unexpected ways. Separately, of course, China continues to look at the political situation in Taiwan with interest. There's been an election in Taiwan resulting in, I think, a result that's not good for China, but somewhat tolerable in the short term, given that there is a split legislature and the Democratic Progressive Party, which China perceives to be insufficiently loyal to the principle of one China, at least as China sees it. That I think continues to be a source of concern. Of course, if we have political change here in the United States with our election, a lot of these dynamics in the short term could change. We could see U.S.-China tensions potentially heighten quite a bit if President Trump were to return to the White House. So that is something to keep an eye on. And then on the Korean Peninsula, Kim Jong-un continues to develop his capabilities, but the North Koreans right now are exporting a lot of their missiles to the Russians. And so if you look at what the North Koreans have been doing this year so far with their military exercises, it's all involved cruise missiles, recently artillery, tank systems. They don't seem to really be, in my view, looking for a deliberate conflict with South Korea. But again, the possibility of miscalculation and escalation, inadvertently or accidentally, I think remains high on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, speaking of North Korea, there's been a lot of saber rattling over the past few years from Mr. President Kim. In fact, I believe it was during the Trump administration that it came to a head when there was actual threat against Guam. How realistic is that? I mean, it has not happened. It's never he's never gone through with his threats, but he continues to rattle the sabers.
Yeah, so you're talking about the August 2017 threat. In August 2017, Kim Jong-un threatened to envelop the waters around Guam with four intermediate range ballistic missiles. That was an interesting time. The North Koreans were seeking to demonstrate to the United States that they had a credible nuclear deterrent. And of course, Guam is the closest U.S. territory with U.S. citizens from North Korea. And for a number of decades, I mean, North Korea had sought to have this capability to be able to threaten U.S. territory with U.S. citizens with its own missile capabilities. And specifically in August 2017, of course, that was also the period of the fire and fury threats being made by President Trump against Kim Jong-un. So it was a tense time. I think the North Koreans were also experimenting with what their new nuclear capabilities could do for them. So that threat to sort of envelop Guam, they never actually committed to it in an unqualified way. Kim had sort of indicated that he was reviewing the plans and he might proceed with it. And their core complaint, of course, was U.S. bomber operations from Andersen Air Force Base. That was where the U.S. was flying many of the B-1B bombers to the Korean Peninsula. And those are non-nuclear capable bombers, but the North Koreans, they don't care. They see those bombers effectively as strategic nuclear delivery systems, and so they reacted in this very harsh way. But I do think, if U.S.-North Korea tensions do spike again, Guam might find itself at the tip of North Korea's threats once again, unfortunately.
Yeah, fascinating discussion. Ankit, we've got to take a quick break. We'll be back with more with our discussion with Ankit Panda of the Carnegie Endowment on International Peace right after this break.
The Hub is presented by Calvo Enterprises, Inc. The Hub is presented by Calvo Enterprises, Inc.
All right, everyone, welcome back. We are back with our discussion with Ankit Panda, who is an international security expert for the Carnegie Endowment on International Peace. And Ankit, before we took the break, we were talking about, the regional threats and possibilities. And but in essence, this has been going on for quite a long time, and you don't see any imminent threats to Guam at this point?
I don't know. We always have to be vigilant, of course, and I think that's a big part of where deterrence comes in, right? The United States intends to dissuade America's adversaries from carrying out attacks. But imminently, I mean, based on my read of the geopolitical environment on the Korean Peninsula and in the Taiwan Strait right now, I don't see an imminent crisis or a conflict.
Yeah, and a missile attack on Guam is not inevitable. But what should and must be done to continue to avoid one?
Absolutely. So I think we end up right back at that idea of deterrence, which is fundamentally much more an art than a science, but it involves communicating to America's adversaries that the benefits of attacking will be outweighed by the costs. And there's two ways to do that. One is deterrence by punishment, where you simply tell the other side that America will have the ability to retaliate, and they will endure costs if they do decide to attack the United States. This is traditionally how nuclear deterrence has worked. But I think more realistically, what we see happening right now on Guam is part of what at least those of us who work in more academic settings like to call deterrence by denial, indicating to America's adversaries that attacking Guam will not take the U.S. military out of the fight effectively, that an attack will not succeed to accomplish the military objectives that America's adversaries seek. And so that is ultimately where I think missile defense is, I think, part of that picture, but it cannot be the entire picture. And I worry that what we're seeing right now is an overemphasis on missile defense, which of course is also not essentially the most cost-effective way to enhance Guam's resilience, Guam's ability to endure these attacks. And when I say that, I mean both for the U.S. military and for the people of Guam and Guam's ability to function as a civilian society as well. And so part of, I think the conversation has to be broadened to consider the role that shelters, the hardening of utilities, of infrastructure, the dispersal of assets, right? Dispersal is, of course, tricky. As you've noted, Guam is not very, unfortunately, not very rich in land, and the U.S. military already controls about a third of the island. So dispersing on Guam might not be possible, but that's where I think dispersing into broader facilities, territories in the Pacific and to U.S. allies could potentially be valuable. And so all of that, I think, plays a picture in dissuading attacks on the United States. But again, deterrence alone cannot be the solution because ultimately, all of this, what I just described, is going to lead to an adaptation, a response by America's adversaries. And so this is how you end up in a spiral where they react to what we're doing, and so we react to what they're doing, and so on and so forth. And so, how do you stop that spiral? Well, one of the lessons we, I think, take away from the Cold War, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union, I think, endured similar dynamics, is that arms control and diplomacy can be a useful tool. And the Biden administration right now is trying to call China to the table for arms control talks. There isn't much interest in Beijing, partly because I think they're in the middle of a process of building up their forces. But I do think once China gets to a place where they feel that they have reached some kind of a steady state and they no longer see benefits in investing additional resources and expanding their own military capabilities, they may be able to contemplate arms control. Ultimately, arms control can only happen when there's mutual interest, when both countries see something to gain from coming to the table. So it can't simply be that the United States sees benefits, because of course we would love to have China agree to pursue fewer weapons, better weapons, so on and so forth. But China too has to perceive an advantage in coming to the diplomatic table with the United States.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What do you think would be the tipping point for this de-escalation?
So something I hear a lot, which I don't necessarily believe myself, but this is an idea that is somewhat rooted in history, which is that maybe it takes a crisis, right? Again, in the Cold War context, it was not long after the Cuban Missile Crisis that the United States and the Soviet Union set up a hotline and slowly began a series of steps, culminating eventually in strategic arms limitation talks by the end of the 1960s, resulting in the first major arms control agreement on strategic forces by the early 70s. Now, the problem with the crisis and the problem with the Cuban Missile Crisis is that, of course, if you roll the dice on the Cuban Missile Crisis 10 times, you walk away alive maybe 3 of those times, right? So a crisis is not a recommendation. There's no way to say that the U.S. and China should walk to the nuclear brink, see that it is simply unsustainable and terrifying, and then discover arms control. So I'm not necessarily persuaded by that, but that is something that people suggest as one way to sort of break this. The other, I think, involves, again, proactive diplomatic messaging, right? Communicating to the other side that there is, again, a space of mutual benefit. And so the U.S. has to be ultimately, I think, talking about, we have to indicate that we are willing to talk about certain things that historically have not been very popular here in Washington. So this would potentially mean opening up issues like conventional forces, missile defense, space capabilities, so on and so forth, for a open-ended discussion with China. But again, even if we do this, there has to be reciprocity on the other side. There has to be political will, and I don't see that at the moment. Another suggestion that I make in my work is to actually raise better awareness of this in Asia. In Asia and more broadly in the Pacific. And so smaller countries in the region, in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, need to take a broader interest in the possibility of a major conflict between the U.S. and China, and recognize that such a conflict could really have enormous stakes for their region, given that these are two nuclear-armed countries. And so their role in potentially creating the conditions diplomatically, maybe in multilateral settings like some of the ASEAN-led meetings, to talk more about nuclear issues, talk more about confidence building, arms control, and risk reduction. I do think that can, again, create an environment in which arms control could be more likely.
Yeah. In the meantime, there is still, we do need to face the reality of the possibility of, some kind of missile incident. And you mentioned earlier that you think maybe should be more emphasis on other things like infrastructure. Can the civilian government, or should the civilian government play a role in that?
I think so. I mean, absolutely. I think the civilian government plays the role of advocating for the people of Guam, and so this is ultimately. I think this is a win-win proposition. I think the ability for Guam to remain a functional civil society in a time of conflict, of course, is not something that will be easy to do. But again, infrastructure resiliency has benefits in a war. It has benefits in a typhoon scenario, for instance. I was just in Guam and I saw how many of the power lines are above ground, for instance. Moving all of that underground is going to be extremely expensive, but that is something that I think benefits the people of Guam, and it benefits the ability for the U.S. military as well in a time of conflict. So I think we need to expand the aperture of how we think about resiliency more broadly. Again, missile defense is part of the solution, but it cannot be the entire conversation.
All right. Let me get you out of here with some parting words for the people of Guam about the missile defense system in general, and maybe relieve some of their apprehensions, if you would.
Well, sure. So, what I will say is that, like I said, I take a rather middle of the road approach to thinking about the role of missile defense systems, right? Especially regional missile defense systems. They will play a role. They will complicate planning for those who may seek to attack the United States with long-range missiles, but they will simply never be a shield, right? They will never have the effect of rendering any territory, even Guam, which of course, if the enhanced air and missile defense plan proceeds, Guam will be the most densely defended airspace on Earth. Despite that, they simply will not be able to function in that role of being a full-scale shield. And so the answer here isn't, of course, to say that missile defense has no role, but again, it's to ask those tough questions about what is the cost effectiveness of a variety of measures we might take. Missile defense, of course, has the disadvantage of being extremely costly. These are very sophisticated, technologically impressive systems, and so they just don't come cheap. And so from the perspective of what the United States could do for the people of Guam on a per dollar basis, my opinion would be that missile defense probably isn't going to be the answer to that question. And so I think the people of Guam, the civilian government in Guam, need to ask those questions of those folks in Washington making the decisions to enhance defense in Guam and in the Pacific more broadly. That's what I would say.
All right. Ankit Panda, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Ankit Panda is an international security expert with the Carnegie Endowment on International Peace. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. I'm Nestle Conta. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you again next week.